Jenny got her PhD at Texas, and I wanted to say she's a demographer specializing in migration. I just want to say two things about her. First is she's finishing up a 3-year term as the current editor of the journal Demography. So I was had the joy of being on the publications committee when she was when that group at Penn State was getting started up. So great service to the profession. Thank you. I hope everyone is thanking.
I just kind of wonder how many people are waiting till we're done.
No. And the other thing is that Jenny and Irene, who we had a few weeks ago in the brown bag, have a new summer workshop on migration, which was held last year at Berkeley, and this summer is going to be held at Penn State. And are you still accepting applications?
They're due on the 18th.
Okay, they're due on the 18th. So with that, Jenny says she has lots to tell us. I don't want to take any more of her time,
Okay.
so thank you so much.
Thanks for inviting me, and I just want to tell you, I was just telling Josh, this is the first time I'm giving this talk, and the results that I'm going to show you were disclosed for review on Monday. So it was very much of a very fast-paced kind of effort to kind of put it together for you all. So I'm pretty excited about it. So I'm going to talk about the topic of third-generation delay in educational attainment among Mexican Americans. And this comes from a new project that I have that we're now calling the Immigrant Generation Project. These are my collaborators on this project. It includes Jim Bachmeyer at Temple, Brad Foster at the Census Bureau, and graduate students Kendall Lowry and Cody Spence. Also, I'd like to acknowledge my funders. I've got funding from the Russell Sage Foundation. The U.S. Census Bureau has been tremendously helpful for me on this project, and without them it would not be possible, and they've actually devoted a lot of staff time just for my project. And then, of course, the Population Research Institute supports the RDC at Penn State, so I'm acknowledging their support as well. So I'm going to talk about this. I didn't know if you saw this like last week in the news. I saw him, Tom Brokaw, he was like at one of those panel discussions, and he just said something sort of out of the blue, which caught my ear. It was, he talked about how he thought Hispanics should work harder at assimilation. And so there's a lot of different ways to unpack that statement, and he took a lot of flack for saying it, and I can imagine why. You know, one of them is attributing, sort of thinking about assimilation as something that requires personal effort to do, as opposed to there being barriers in the place of this happening. But the second one is just this assumption that it's not happening at all. And so I'm going to set aside this idea about the mechanisms that would lead to or not lead to assimilation, but I want to talk more specifically about even just whether or not it's happening. And so, and I'm going to focus, he in his interview here, he talked about language assimilation, but I'm going to talk about education. So, okay. So here is a phenomenon that has been focused on quite a bit, called, we've been calling it third generation delay. And it's this issue here. So if you look at Mexican Americans, and you break them down by generational status, and you look at their levels of educational attainment, you do tend to see very low levels of education for the first generation. So this is less than high school, and then more than high school. And so you tend to see like half the population not completing high school. And very few here, 1/5, going beyond high school.
And 30% remaining, where are they?
What was that?
That's 50% and 20%, that's 70%?
This is in 2015, ages 25 to 39, and this is 50%.
The rest are exactly the same.
Yeah.
You see the middle categories?
I did not show you the middle category.
Okay, thank you.
The middle category is completed high school but did not go beyond high school.
Okay, thanks.
So, and then if you go to the second generation, you see quite a big change here. So now 13% of the second generation completed high school, only did not finish high school, and close to half, or a little more than half, went beyond high school. So it's basically a flip of those associations. But then if you look at the third generation, there is just virtually no change at all between the second and the third. And if you compare the third generation to whites, non-Hispanic whites without immigrant parents, you see even bigger disparities here. And so this is the problem that a lot of people have focused on and have interpreted these are cross-sectional changes or differences in generational status that are observed contemporaneously in 2015. And so when we look at one generation to the next, we don't actually see the third generation is not the children of the second generation, and the second generation are not the children of the first generation. So these are completely different, we're calling vintages, going back to the original migration event. So, but whatever. So a lot of people have focused on stuff like this and thought about low starting points for immigrants. And the idea here, this has kind of raised a lot of debate about what kind of immigrants should we be admitting. Is it even fair, really, to admit people with very low levels of education if there's no ladder within American society for them to climb? Should we go to more of a point system like Canada has, and this is part of the RAISE Act that was recently proposed by the Trump administration, to increase use immigration as a way to increase the human capital of the population. And then I have one more point there, is like more time might be required for us to expect immigrants to kind of catch up if they start at such low starting points. And when you think about low starting points, this is not showing up very well, but this is the percentage of Mexicans in immigrants arriving here with less than a high school degree. So back in the 1940s here, virtually everybody who arrived here from Mexico did not have a high school degree. This has changed a lot over time, such that now it's about 50%. And that matches what I just showed you before. This is with a high school degree, and this is with college or attended college. So there's been a lot of change in the starting points. And this change could actually produce the pattern that we're seeing in terms of this third generation delay. So if you think about how a lot of what produces sort of educational attainment for children comes from their parents, and the kind of how the status is, according to the status attainment model, there's a strong correlation between parents' educational attainment and child's educational attainment. And so if we can imagine that there's a certain amount of sort of mobility that occurs between one generation to the next, the first generation here, let's say that everybody had the same starting points from one vintage of sort of immigrant cohort to the next. And so this would be the first generation, the second generation, and the third generation. So if you look at this cross-sectionally, you would see this steady increase in educational attainment. But if you have one of the vintages starting out with a very low starting point, you end up seeing this delay pattern here. Okay? So that's one idea that's happening. You know, it's not just that they start out with really low educational attainments, it's that there's an unevenness in this over time. Okay. Another issue, though, has to do with mobility patterns. And this has to, you know, so there's been a lot of stuff written on this, and how are we to interpret what we're seeing in terms of generational attainments, generational patterns and attainments. Is that maybe related to the ability of parents, given their resources, to launch their children and get them into higher levels of educational attainment than they themselves acquired? And, you know, one of the key papers that keeps getting cited over and over again is this by Grace Cow and Marta Tienda, where they really talked about this immigrant optimism and described how children of immigrants actually have an advantage in the sense that their parents oftentimes make huge investments in their children, and one of the reasons they move here is for a better life for their children. There's a tremendous amount of pressure on children of immigrants to do well in school, to make their parents' sacrifices worthwhile. And so maybe, that there's something going on here with this second generation, that they get sort of this boost in their effects. And so maybe we wouldn't expect the third generation to do as well, because they don't have that same kind of boost.
Should we think about the foreign-born children who grow up in the U.S. in either first or second, or does that matter for what we're, for most of these discussions?
The foreign-born children are similar. They're like the 1.5 generation. Yeah, actually they are very similar, and I haven't been treating them differently. Maybe
They're similar to which, the second or the first?
The second generation.
Second generation.
Yeah, often, yeah. But then there's also this literature about talking about social barriers, and especially for children and groups that are not of the European origins, and especially for Mexicans. And so, the segmented assimilation model was proposed in the 1990s, and then there, Eddie Tejas and Vilma Ortiz published Generations of Exclusion, and really tried to document how this group has become racialized. And so they've encountered, especially as they go from the second to the third generation, come to perceive there being more discrimination, and have not necessarily been able to overcome those sorts of barriers, especially as peers become a greater influence over and above what their parents provide for them. So now there's also this other idea, these institutional barriers. And this, I think, when you read Elba and Nee's book about assimilation, they really spend a lot of time talking about institutional barriers for ethnic minorities in the pre-civil rights era. And so they're proposing that maybe a lot of the this inequality that we're seeing today are vestiges of something that happened in earlier generations. And so maybe the problem really is something that happened in the past and may not necessarily be something that's happening today. But because of the way children get so many resources from their parents, that this carries through and kind of trickles down generations. And so it just might be a long time before we start to see equality in outcomes, even if there's equality in mobility. Does that make sense? So another point of this, and I'm just becoming aware of this literature, is this Americanization movement. So we often look back and say, oh, well, what about Italians? They came in as poor labor migrants. Shouldn't they be similar to the Mexicans? And why shouldn't we expect there to be equal outcomes? But this Americanization movement was something that happened in the 20s and 30s in the Northeast of the United States. And there was a lot of emphasis put on, well, we've got all these immigrants here, and they need to be more Americanized. And so this progressive movement started pushing for more and more public education, and put a lot of energy and resources in providing free public education for all. But unfortunately, this was something that happened mostly in the Northeast and didn't filter down into the South or places like Texas, where most of the Mexican immigrants lived. And so, so these poor labor migrants from like Italy and from Ireland, who live mostly in the Northeast, may have benefited from that Americanization movement, whereas the Mexicans may not have. So again, something that goes back to the past and trying to understand inequalities that we see today. So, so this emphasis on mobility, I'm pulling up this mobility table, so just to remind you kind of how these things work. If we just like cross-tabulate parents' education by child's education, you get this mobility table where if people just end up along the diagonal, you see no change. But if people end up in the blue area, you see upward mobility, and then in the green you would see downward mobility. And so our question really is like, are these children of immigrants more likely to end up in the blue areas than in the green, or in the status quo? The worst thing is to end up here and not change. Now, most of the Mexican immigrants, especially in the 40s and 50s, they arrived in this cell, and we're discovering a lot of their children stayed in that cell. And so that is another issue here. So, Okay. So we're going to go back to this chart, and this would be like a picture of this delayed assimilation in that third generation, where you see, maybe this is sort of a stylistic version of that. But the other idea is where you have the institutional barriers in the 50s, 40s, 50s, and 60s, and then that straightening out later on after we've corrected sort of what's happening in our institutions. Okay, so what we're trying to do is see really what we find. You know, what kind of pattern are we going to see? And oh, and this is like, oh geez, it's all bad. Okay. So our research questions is what explains that relatively low educational attainment among the third generation Mexican Americans? Is it the low starting points? Is it low mobility during the pre-civil rights era? Maybe it's low mobility during the post-civil rights era. And maybe it's a combination of all of those. And just tell you right now, it is. Yeah.
Maybe you're going to get to this, in which case I'll hold my question.
Yeah.
When we think about third generation, we're talking about 4 grandparents, and so are we talking about all 4 grandparents are immigrants, or any grandparent, or how do we think about them?
It's any at this moment, okay. Yeah. And we haven't fully explored, what happens if you have 3 immigrant parents or 2, you know, and
It's just any or none.
Yeah, and I haven't, yeah, so we're keeping it simple for now.
Related question. Before we have 3+, and now you're going to focus on
Just the third.
the third. Okay.
Yes, yeah, and it's the third only generation. Up until now, we haven't been able to identify the third
Right.
one, but with my data, we're gonna get at it. So, okay, so lots of challenges in trying to address these questions. There's a lot of data limitations, and a lot of this generational research has looked at the CPS because it has parents' place of birth as well as the person's place of birth, so you can identify the first, second, and the third plus generation. But we don't know much about the parents and grandparents' characteristics. We can't identify the third only generation. We get third plus, but not the third only. And there's also this troubling thing about ethnic attrition. And I don't know, how many of you are familiar with that concept? Yeah, some of you, okay, so I'll tell you, it's Duncan and Trejo had this paper published a few years ago, but it really was something that was in the air even before that, where, now they focused on Hispanics for the most part. What happens is, as you go from one generation to the next, there's a lot of interracial marriage, or interethnic marriage, and the children of those couples have options about how to identify themselves. And it turns out as you go to higher and higher generations, the less likely those children of grandparents who were Mexican immigrants do not identify themselves as Mexican or Hispanic. And this tendency to do this is actually more likely among those who have higher levels of education. And so this is why this is a bias that's could be explaining some of this, you know, third generation delay, because the most successful children of that third generation are actually no longer in the sample. Okay. Now, ideally, we'd like to have like something like the PSID to look at this, but the PSID doesn't really have any satisfactory information on immigrants in it. So here's what we're going to do. What we do is we start with the 1940 census, and it's 100% count of the US population. And at that time, there was no short form or long form, it was all long form. And this comes from Minnesota.
That's not, that, like, wasn't parents' birthplace only asked of 1 of 20 people?
I think we have it for everybody. Yeah. There are some other things that are only sample items, but this, I don't see how we, I'll look that up for you, but I'm pretty sure we have it for everybody. Okay. And then we also bring in the CPSs in the middle period, you know, and this is supposed to capture the second generation, and then we have the 2000 census, and then a bunch of ACSs. So what we're doing is we're linking this all together intergenerationally. So the Census Bureau has this record linkage infrastructure program that they're running right now called the CLIP project. And what they do is they assign what's called a PIC, a personal, what does PIC mean? P-I-K.
Personal identification key.
Key, yeah, I was thinking number, you know, PIN, but it's a PIC number. They assign it to everybody that they can assign it to, and it's based on social security numbers, but it's also based on name, address, date of birth, and that sort of information for people who don't have social security numbers. And it's meant to be a unique identifier for that person that then can be followed through all of the other census data that they collect. And so if somebody appears in one census and then another census and a third, you can theoretically link those all together. Okay, so there's the PIC. And we don't actually get this identifying information, we get the PICs in the RDC. And then we link those together. And so this is a massive project. My RA had to learn SAS to do this because it will explode most statistical packages. So she learned SAS really fast, and it takes many hours to do the merging because of the large numbers, millions and millions of cases. Okay, so what we do is we start with the 1940 census. We identify parents who are living with children in the 1940 census. Then we take those children, those records, and link those to the CPS records, and now those children are adults. Then we look at their children in the CPS and take their records and link it to the 2000 and the ACSs when they are adults. So we have 3 generations over 8 decades of time. And then all of the information that has been collected about them and their households for those key points in time.
And so a lot of, you're looking at, that's right. The people who came after 1940, how does that influence the analysis?
We don't have them in the analysis, and I will get to that soon. Yeah. So it's mostly an historical project, but it's for the purpose of understanding how it is that we have that 3rd generation looking the way it is. Okay, so it is a cohort kind of historical analysis. So the CLIP data was analyzed in the RDC. Here I have to show you all this stuff. It was disclosed so I can show it to you on that date. That was just Monday, I think. And of course, these are our opinions and not theirs. Okay, so here's the cases. So starting in 1940, we have 44 million observations of parents living with children. Those are the number of their children, 56 million. So then those, there's a lot of, it goes down to 109,000 who are caught in the CPS because it's a sample, it's not 100%. Those second generation are living with 79,000 children. And of those 79,000 children, we're left with 19,300 third generation as adults in the ACS and the census. Jennifer, you look like...
So, this is totally valiant and I'm extremely impressed. Looking at the 100,000 out of the 56 million.
Yeah.
Based on the sampling, what would you expect? How bad is the attrition?
Well, I'm going to get to that in a minute. Yeah. So this is just sort of getting at the numbers that we're able to kind of capture with this. And
this is amazing.
so here's the 1940. So if we just focus on the immigrants in 1940, these are the immigrant parents. Those are their children, the second generation children, and this is the pure third generation in the ACS. And those numbers on the third generation are rounded for some of this stuff. They changed their rounding rules between 2 different disclosures. And so the first disclosure I could get all of the numbers, and then later I had to round everything to the nearest 100. So, yeah.
Is this all immigrants or just Mexican immigrants?
These are all immigrants. Okay. And then here is the
Sorry,
breakdown.
Can you just repeat the difference between the CPS, the 70,000 and the 5,000? Just the third generation, what's the difference between those two? The third column?
We can find.
What was that?
The 5 and the number
Oh,
above it.
okay.
Yeah, what's the difference
So
between those?
this number here,
And the one below it?
okay, so these are the parents, this is the second generation parents, the third generation children
In the CPS?
in the CPS. And then of those, 5,200 are captured in the ACS as adults. So they're children here, and now they're adults.
Those are the same people.
Yes,
And the reason it's not 100% is because the ACS is a sample and just because they
Yes.
don't match everybody.
yeah, and the 2000 census is also a sample because we're using the long form.
But the 20,000 and the 16,000, those are in the same household. So there's no matching involved.
Yes, exactly. So when they're in the parallel, like the horizontal, they're in the same household, that's how we know who they are and what their relationships are.
And also, I've always said, you don't need the parental birthplace in 1940.
No,
You just need every individual's birthplace. So that's why you're able to use 100%.
well, no, because we do have their birthplace though.
We have every individual's, but since the parent's birthplace is a sample question, you don't actually need the sample birth question
Not
because your people are
necessarily.
living with.
But I have immigrants, these are all known to, this 7 million, those are all first generations.
Right.
And we know that because we have their reported place of birth. So, yeah. Okay, and then we also have a lot of variation across groups. So I think for the first time, we can track 3 generations of all of those different European immigrant groups. And so, but we also have a fair number of Mexicans. It's not huge, and I would like the sample size to get bigger, and it will over time as more censuses are picked in between. So this is sort of the minimum that we're working with right now. So Mexicans, you know, we're down to 550 in that third only generation. But for that 550, we have 3 generations of information going back for their parents and grandparents. And then we also have other groups to compare them with. Okay? And to the extent that these samples, you know, we're going down to small numbers, but if they're random samples, like they should be, we end up with something looking kind of similar to that first generation.
Do you know offhand what the age distributions of the third generation? Because they are all, what they have in common is immigrant grandparents in
Actually,
1940.
you know, there's a lot of variation on that. And I was surprised, you know, they're supposed to be young adults, but we have some people in their 80s in that. And so they're pretty old, some of them are old. And so we haven't looked at the birth cohort effects yet, but we're going to be doing that soon. So, I mean, there's just not very many that age, but there are some.
Could they be? Is
Right,
that
'cause
logically even
1940
possible?
If they had multi-generational households, right, in 1940.
Yeah, if they were caught in a multi-generational household. Yeah. Most of them are young adults though at that time.
And could you just re-answer Jenna's question about how many grandparents they have that are from the country?
At least one,
At least one.
yes. Yeah. So, yeah, there are a lot of what I would say kind of this messiness right there in that. And so I'm presenting this in a little more clean fashion than it's probably warranted. But
And so just building on Josh's question, so if it's at least one, that means that you could, in theory, have the same people in multiple, right? The same individual could be in that top box of having being third generation with one grandparent who is Central and Eastern European, and could also be in that third box that they have one grandparent who's Canadian,
oh, yes.
hypothetically.
Yeah, we had to actually make a priority list to make this, this category. You know, so like if they had mixtures of different ancestries,
Right.
we ended up prioritizing Mexicans since that was our focus.
So they only appear in one place.
Yeah, they're only in one place.
Great.
Yeah. But theoretically, you could go back into the data and code it differently or account for multiple ancestries or whatever, you know.
This is
so the CLIP data, cool thing, 3 generations, 8 decades. It's nationally representative, so it doesn't just focus on 1 city or 2 cities. And we don't have the ethnic attrition problem because everybody, we know what their grandparents' ethnic origins were. And so we can actually look at that. We can see what the people in the ACS respond and say what their ancestry is, and we can look to see how that compares with the ethnic origins of their immigrant grandparents. We've only really started this project this fall, so I haven't I'm telling you what we can do, but don't sit here and wait for me to tell you the answer. Limitations. We only have the pre-1940 immigrant arrivals, so we don't have the new post-65 immigrant cohorts in here. We really can only look at families who stay, and we have this thing called match bias. And for that, I'm going to talk a little bit about this. I don't know how much interest there is because I'm going to run out of time. Are you interested?
Yeah.
You could feed us too.
Okay, so not everybody gets assigned pick.
Yeah.
There's some people it's easier to assign a pick than others because of the name that they have, or because they don't have a social security number. There's reasons why you wouldn't get a pick. Also, you have to be in certain stages of the life course to be matched and have co-residential children at these points in time that we're trying to look for them, right? So like the second generation children, so this is like in the CPSs, they have to have co-resided with a parent in 1940, those parents in the second generation. And they can't have died yet. You know, if they die, then we don't get them, right? And the third generation children, they have to be living with their parent when we find them in the CPS. And so all of the timing of these life course things have to line up for us to get them in our linked sample. So like, for example, we tried to model this. So this is from a projection. In the blue area is the number of children in the third generation who could potentially be captured and would be living in their parents' household in order for us to find them, right? Now the red part, what is that one? I'm sorry, I'm not seeing the colors.
Mother didn't live with parent in 1940, maybe?
Yeah, so the mother didn't live with the parent in 1940, so that mother's children would never be caught in our sample. The green one is they weren't born yet. You know, they were born later.
What is this all a proportion of? Sorry.
Out of 100% of all of the third generation children.
Okay.
Yeah. Now the purple is they died before we could capture them. The green, or the turquoise, is the mother died, so we never found the mother in the CPS, therefore we never found the child. And then this part up here is they moved out of their parents' household before we could find them. Okay? And these are just sort of based on probabilities, but I put it all together to kind of model what I think the universe looks like. And then this is when we're looking for them. Okay? So it's not ideal. I mean, ideally, we'd rather have some like 1960, 1970 census, and instead, the Census Bureau has picked these data. Okay? So it's not great. I'm still getting a sample, but I have to wait until they're done doing those other censuses before I can get what I feel like is a better sample. Does that make sense? So what are we left with? What we're trying to do now is we're modeling the probability that they end up in our sample, going from the first to the second generation and then from the second to the third. And so we model those probabilities here, and I can get into that in a little bit. And then we create these inverse probability weights that we then apply to the sample. And it's supposed to apply these to the third generation and weight them back up to the point where their grandparents kind of look like the 1940 full set of parents. So, for example, here's grandmother's education These are all the mothers who potentially are grandmothers later on. And they have very low levels of education in 1940. But if you look at the linked sample of grandmothers, they're more educated. So when we apply the inverse probability weight that we constructed, we correct a little bit for that. I think we did an okay job. It could be better.
But it's all based on presence of children
Yeah.
in 1940, things like that,
Yeah.
not on numbers of vowels in their last name? or
No,
anything?
no, we don't have that information because census
That's
won't give it to us.
okay.
Yeah. So here's another example. This is grandmother's age. This is all grandmothers in 1940. And that's their age, their actual age. But the linked grandmothers are younger. And this is the sort of weighted age. Again, it's not perfect. I think we need to work on this a little bit more. But what I'm showing you is, I'm going to show you results that are based on this weighted set of estimates.
So are you going to be looking at education?
Yes.
So if you go back to the picture of the distribution of probabilities that with the waves, one more back. This one, yeah. Whoops. So the not co-residing with parent are out of your sample. Don't you think that's going to be related to educational attainment?
It could be, yeah.
But the educational attainment is at the time you first observe them, or do you get to see them later when they're...
Yes, so the educational attainment is observed for those third generation children who then are followed up in the ACS, and they're usually above age 25.
Okay.
And so we're constraining the statistics to 25 and older, and they're reflecting back on how much education they've attained.
Okay, so you could be in graduate school living by
Yes.
yourself, but you
Yeah.
just were living with your mom back
Yeah.
at the capture time.
Yeah,
Okay.
so the only reason we have to they're just more or less in our sample, and we're hoping that we're getting them when they're children living in their parents' house.
Thank you.
So, okay, so results, okay. So I'm going to show you three groups. African Americans as a sort of a comparison group, Mexican Americans, and non-Hispanic whites. And the non-Hispanic whites here are combined together. So they're just all whites, whether or not they have immigrant backgrounds. And I'm going to break it out in a little bit, okay? So here's African Americans, and this is the percentage who did not complete high school. So in the first generation in 1940, almost all of them had not finished high school. It's just very, very small percentage. In the 70s and 80s, the second generation, about half had finished high school. The third generation, and this is the post-2000 era, what is that, 13%, I think. Okay, so there's the African Americans.
Those are literally immigrant African Americans?
No, these are all African Americans regardless.
Obviously first generation.
Of the sample.
Yeah. Yeah, so these are African Americans picked up in 1940, regardless of whether their parents have immigrant backgrounds or not. So most of them are like 8th, 9th, 10th generation. Those are Mexicans. So they look very similar to African Americans. And then here's whites. And so whites you'll see here is that, first of all, they're a little bit more likely to have finished high school than African Americans and Mexicans. They experienced a big rapid change between this first generation and the second generation. And this is a mixture of immigrants. So here when we talk about generations, these are like family generations, not necessarily immigrant generations. Okay, so that's finishing high school. And so you see this, it's pretty big, dramatic improvement that the other groups didn't experience nearly as much. Now here's the percentage who went on beyond high school, and this is important for a lot of trades. Here's African Americans, there's Mexicans, and there's whites. Whites, it's not nearly as high as you might imagine. I think a lot of people think everybody's gone to college because we're on a college campus, and it's just not happening. And so there's not as big of a difference here. But again, you know, I don't know how much of this is like GI Bill stuff or what, you know. Anyway, okay, this is with a bachelor's degree. Okay, same story. Okay,
So those are included in the sum college?
yeah. Okay, so now I also wanted to look to see what's happening with these other European immigrant groups. And this is just the third generation alone. And
Just before, so this is very different than the initial slide you showed us with
yes,
the no change between second and third generation.
I have
There's
not
a lot
seen-
of change between second and third generation.
I don't see any evidence of third generation delay in any of this. So that's a big story, but I'm also seeing a lot of evidence of inequality. So there's inequality, but no third generation delay.
Yeah, that's-
So it's a mixed bag, right? Here's another part of the mixed bag here. So these are the third generation grandchildren of white natives from 1940. Okay, the red bar. So that's the percentage that did not finish high school. Now all these blues, those are the grandchildren of white European immigrants from 1940, and they're doing better. Now maybe that's that immigrant optimism stuff. Now here's whites and Mexicans. Mexicans don't have this immigrant optimism stuff going on with them, and I'm going to show you more evidence of that in a bit. And so they didn't benefit from that. Here's the going on beyond. And so you can see all of these grandchildren of the European immigrants from 1940 are doing better even than the old stock, right? Those people who came much, much earlier in our history. Mexicans are doing the worst here in terms of going beyond high school compared to all the other groups. So this is the bad news part of the story, right? So, okay. This is hard to see, I'm sorry about this. I should not have made it blue. So next thing I'm doing is I'm trying to do this sort of thought experiment. So what would happen if we changed the starting point or the mobility pattern from the first to the second generation or from the second to the third generation for Mexicans to see what would happen if we gave them, for example, whites starting points in 1940 or whites mobility probabilities. And so like if this is like Mexicans and we don't see much change between the first and the second, but a little bit of change between the second and the third, you know, we can imagine that the third generation is sort of this multiplier of all of these mobilities and starting points. So I wrote out the equation. And then what we do is we just say, oh, what if they had whites starting point? How much would that raise the third generation? Or what if we gave them the mobility table between the first and the second generation? How much would that change that? Or maybe it has to do with recent conditions, you know. So that's what we're going to do here. And so these are the simulations I ran. And I think I just explained those. Okay. Can I move on then? Okay. Okay, so what you're seeing here, this is the chart showing the results for attaining, going beyond high school. So higher numbers are better here. And the line here is the comparison group, whites. So that's what you see here. You know, this is what we're going to compare everybody to. So this is non-Hispanic whites with no, they're the grandchildren of the US natives from 1940. And so what's happening here, if the first group here is Mexicans. Okay, so here's the observed disadvantage that they have compared to whites. If we give them equal starting points, it removes a lot of that disadvantage. If we give them equal mobility between the first and the second generation, it closes up some of that disadvantage, but not all of it. If we give them equal mobility between the second and the third generation, it hardly does anything. If we give them equal mobility all across the whole time frame, it sort of does the same thing as changing the starting point. Here's Black, I'm just gonna give you a few other groups to look at. Here's African Americans, it kind of looks similar. The starting points really matter a lot for this group, as well as the early barriers that they had to attaining a post-secondary education. And this is all pre-civil rights era kind of stuff going on here. This is more contemporary. Here are the, what happened there? But here's the European groups. And what you see here is that starting points don't matter. They all have sort of this advantage, and it doesn't close up until you equalize their mobility patterns from the second to the third generation. This was the biggest surprise, and I'll explain in just a second. So if I just take those differences and call them effects, so what is it that explains the, I decompose really, the overall disadvantage that they have in attaining a post-secondary degree, and I can then say, oh, well, this much of it here has to do with having unequal starting points. This has to do, this next bar has to do with unequal early, like pre-civil rights mobility. This has to do with unequal mobility sort of since 1970. And then there's an interaction, in fact, which I haven't figured out how to even explain. So, but you add that all up and that totals the entire discrepancy. So blacks actually have a mobility advantage compared to whites since 1970 in attaining a post-secondary degree. And all of it has to do with this older stuff that held back that group in the before 1970. Okay, now these European groups, they all look the same. Okay, I think these advantages that you're seeing in mobility, I think that's that immigrant optimism, but it's going to, it's for the first and the second generation, but it's also for the third generation. So that's interesting to me because I have never seen evidence of sort of this immigrant optimism carrying over into the third generation. But clearly they're doing better than expected, even in the third generation. Okay, so how much time do I have left?
We are kind of done with the
Okay.
regular presentation. Do you want to say a
No.
couple of words and we can do questions and answers?
I don't have too much else to say. These are the results for less than a high school dropout. No evidence of decline or delay, but they don't do as well. So those are the take-home points.
Great.
Any questions?
Could you go back to the last graph you showed,
Which one?
where you decompose? Yeah.
This is
No,
for,
the one after, I think. The
which
one
one?
where- Or before,
Right.
was it? No.
This one?
No. Okay. so
This one?
This
That
one,
one,
that's
that
it,
one,
yeah. So you say you're surprised because of the
These bars. Yeah.
But I'm not sure, when you said that, I figured maybe I didn't understand what you,
Okay.
to me, it seems pretty obvious because you've been talking about the fact that this is not so much due to behaviors from the immigrants, but more about the constraints. And it seemed to me that a lot of these constraints have to do with discrimination or things that are indirectly discriminating, like where people live and which school they attend and stuff. And you would expect these constraints not to be so strong for people who have Eastern European descent than from Mexican
Well,
or Black.
Let's talk about this one, the Central and Eastern Europeans. Okay, so they started out with lower levels of education than whites, and that pulled them down a little bit. But they have super high, sort of hyper mobility, and between the first and the second generation, and the second and the third generation. And so the literature has usually talked about this immigrant guilt stuff that's gone on. Do you know what I'm talking about? So where
Guilt?
Guilt, yeah. Like, I have to work really hard in school because of the sacrifices my parents went through in order to get me here.
So what's surprising?
Of the children of immigrants.
Yes, the children of immigrants, but I have not heard so much about the grandchildren of immigrants experiencing that same kind of advantage in schooling that their children of immigrants would have gotten. And
So you're not surprised at the comparison between the right-hand side and the left-hand side? You're surprised at the comparison between the right-hand side and the
I'm surprised about,
non-Hispanic, white, native?
I'm surprised by this dark blue bar for the European immigrant groups.
Who are doing better than the
Yes,
native white?
yes.
Okay.
That it continues on to the third generation. It's not just a first to second generation effect.
Rebecca?
Yeah, these are really interesting results. This is so cool. Thank you. I think my question is a little bit more about framing. I know when you started at the beginning, you were talking about assimilation and Americanization, and then you jumped into education. And I'm wondering how you connect those two concepts, because at least my understanding is that assimilation, there are a lot of different strategies for that, and immigrants from different groups will have different outcomes given the assimilation strategies that they use. And I also am interested in the what is the immigrant hope that you called these groups?
For optimism, right?
Yeah. From Northern European areas. I wonder whether it would be more useful to contrast the mobility of Mexican Americans against those like other immigrant groups and see like that difference.
Which other groups are you talking about?
Sorry, so if we're saying that immigrant groups have this immigrant optimism when they come and this extra incentive to work, and we see this happening in white immigrants, and then we see like extra difficulty in mobility in non-white immigrants, does it make sense to compare the discrepancy between non-white immigrants and white long-term Americans? Or does it make sense to compare the discrepancy between non-white immigrants and their immigrant counterparts who have white privilege?
Well, that's what I'm doing here. So even though for all of these groups, I'm comparing them to white non-immigrants, like the grandchildren of non-white immigrants, the fact that they all are being compared to that one point means that when you have the bars going above the line compared to below the line, that the disadvantages here for Mexicans are very apparent compared to these immigrant groups. So you can implicitly make that comparison if you want. In terms of the question about assimilation, I'm using assimilation in a structural sense at the moment. And so by assimilation, we're not really talking about acculturation. I'm talking more about the incorporation of groups into the key institutions of the United States, and that is, in the current situation that we have now, is like getting an education, and that is the key to upward mobility. And given, so that's what I'm doing. And so we don't have any insight at all into acculturation at the moment.
So I was wondering if you probably haven't gotten this far, but the Mexicans who are in the United States in 1940 and you watch through 3 generations, is there kind of a description you can give us of who these people are? Are these people who came to the Southwest and stayed in agriculture the whole time?
So these
our picture of
Mexicans-
Mexican Americans is totally dominated by the last few decades, and this is a special group. Yeah.
I can tell you more, and we're going to be doing more work on this. These are descendants mostly of people who worked in agriculture in Texas.
Okay.
And so we think of a lot of Mexicans as living in California, and it was a much more progressive state in terms of the educational opportunities, even back in the 50s and 60s, than it was in Texas. And in Texas, there was a huge incentive for children growing up, with children of laborers on farms or in ranches or wherever in Texas. There was a huge incentive for them to quit school and go to work. And there wasn't a lot of structure there to incentivize them to stay in school. So that's what we're looking at, is to really understand sort of the compulsory education laws in Texas and how much that mattered for explaining what's going on here.
So David Card has a new paper looking at 1940 where they doing something similar. They're looking at more space in black and white, where they look at the children and the parents in the same household. If they're looking at kids who are 16 to 18, and it's whether the kids are in high school based on the parents' educational attainment. And they're doing this with regard to, say, resources put into schools
Okay.
and how the location
Yeah.
depends on it, and they're trying to identify. So that would be really
Yeah, we're
a good
compiling
connection.
all this contextual data that we're gonna put onto this, but it's hard because it's historical data. And so labor laws are a big part of this, is to understand child labor laws. And but then also, even within Texas, like when desegregation came through, it went through a lot faster in terms of their resistance was lower to desegregation in like Austin and West Texas than it was in East Texas. And so even there, we're trying to get down to the county level and understanding opportunities. So that's what's next on this project after I figure this out.
Andrea.
Yeah. I was just wondering if you were perhaps a bit worried about certain characteristics that affect Mexicans being in the 1940 census, and then being in another survey and whatnot, like just the fact that Mexico is closer to the U.S. means that they could return to Mexico, not be captured in some survey, whereas other immigrants will be in that survey.
Oh yeah, that's a great question, yeah. I mean, we're hoping not, that because most of these people are born in the United States, you know, the second generation are, and so that's most of the, if we don't see a lot of US born Mexican Americans moving back to Mexico, which we don't, hopefully that's not happening so much, but certainly the parents.
Yeah, exactly.
Yeah.
The parents, like, you might miss parents at some point because they move back or they can't find
Yeah, there was this really big, what they called repatriation movement in the 1930s, where they were trying to, it was by force, deport a lot of Mexican Americans, and some of them were US born even. And so we haven't fully looked at the effects of that on us, but yeah.
But to follow up on this, wouldn't that go in the opposite direction? Would the people who left, are they less likely to be successful? And so
I think
you're
so,
actually
but I don't
capturing the most successful of the,
Yeah.
so if anything, you get even more.
That might be, we should look into that. I don't know, that sounds right to me, but I just don't know if that's true.
Time for one more question, yes?
I think this may have to do with voluntary choice, because I've noticed a lot of Mexicans that I know are in the construction trades, and they're pretty good at it too. If you ever seen a Mexican crew put up a house, it's like an Olympic team. No one else has that kind of speed and precision, but you don't get it out of college, and you sort of don't get it out of high school. You get it out of an extensive apprenticeship, which sometimes takes 5 or 7 years. So I'm thinking that maybe from the point of view of the people involved, they may not consider college education worthwhile because they're not going to learn anything there that relates to their profession.
I'm going to show you something in just a second. I tried to also look at some post-1960 birth cohorts on educational attainment and mobility, just to see what would we see if we happen to pick up these post-1965, the new immigrants. And what you see here, oops, oh crap, there, okay. So here's the pre-1940 birth cohorts, the 40 to 60 birth cohorts, and the post-1960 birth cohorts. And I want to go back one, actually. Okay, this is upward mobility. This is like doing better than what your parents did. And so the red are the second generation, the blue, the green is the third generation Mexicans, and the blue are the whites. And so if you look at the most contemporary experiences of Mexicans, they actually outperform themselves in school than whites do. They're
And
going
it's literally
farther in
that.
school, given their parents' educational attainment, they're doing better. And so only now are we seeing immigrant optimism occurring among Mexicans, but it's the newest cohorts, it's not the old ones. Yeah.
Thanks, Ray. This is the link stuff, not the cross-sectional.
This is from the GSS.
Oh, okay.
Yeah, I didn't have access to this for the data. Yeah.
One last question on Andrea's point about going back to Mexico, do you think that the kind of people who you're able to pick up in these repeated surveys, particularly among these rural agricultural workers, that you're, I mean, we know there are big undercounts in the census, in the CPS, in the ACS. Have you thought about this with regard to your Mexican sample?
You mean in the ACS?
That you're actually getting you're selecting towards people with permanent addresses
Yes.
who are responding to surveys, and that those people will be more likely to be educated,
Yeah.
and that sort of thing.
Yeah. So if anything, this is a more optimistic view than the reality.
Okay.
I think that's probably right. Okay.
Thank you so much.